So I was looking for my little boy, but I found him. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being at our Trust Forum 2. I know some of you I don't know. But one thing I know about all of you is that by the time you walk out of here today, you'll want more of what we're offering today. And at the end of our time, I will let you know where you can go to get more of some of the content we're not going to be able to cover today, but also to carry on the conversation about trust. In just a few minutes, we'll be bringing a one-on-one conversation with Chris Cuomo and the former governor of Illinois, Rod Blagojevich. We have an amazing panel on digital privacy and how that impacts trust. And we have guests today from Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo, and they will be having a conversation with Jessica Vassalero from the Wall Street Journal. So I thought this morning the best place to start was to take a look at the big picture.
Hundreds have led to a national ag recall, and it's grown to more than 300.
I am deeply sorry for any accident that Toyota tried.
There's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. You know, I'd like my life back.
Once again, Mr. Thomas, I think he misremembers the conversation that we had.
I've acted in a way that violates my obligations to my family.
I have let you down. I have let down my fans.
VP is getting slammed.
Goldman Sachs is charged with failing to disclose one of its clients helped create and then bet against them. All of this is so important to discuss.
That's a little bright, but that's okay. So probably like many of you, the ripple effect has been on my mind a lot lately, specifically working with clients, helping them to perform in a persistent low trust environment. We had a year of headlines that painted a pretty dreary picture for anyone who might have banked on the rebound of customer trust in order to help us improve the economic condition of our country. So, you know, we go from tainted eggs to contaminated children's medicines to man-made environmental disasters to life-threatening manufacturing defects. The turbulence of all of this, the result of pebble after pebble after pebble having been dropped, has resulted in an engulfed wave of distrust. And what's so interesting about that engulfed wave of distrust, which is what we hear so much about, and I'll talk about in a second as well, is that at the same time it is a fact that not all organizations are failing stakeholders on a grand scale. There are organizations that are experiencing the ripple effects of breakdowns in their industries. The evidence for this is not merely anecdotal. There are now linguistic and analytical tools that have the capability of mining an infinite number of online data. And essentially, we're all listening on consumer conversations. We ourselves at Unit 7 are developing such a tool to be able to listen in a little bit better and fine-tune on a trust lens. And if you were doing the same thing in your organizations, you probably would agree with me to say that it can be kind of discouraging sometimes when we listen to the conversations of consumers in their own words. Studies do show that trust is rising in some sectors, it's being lowered in others. The data is contradicting itself, but one thing is extremely consistent, and that is even when we have studies that are showing an increase in trust, respondents are wary. There is one survey where trust is cited as on the rise, and there's a striking, very confident insight from consumers, and that they strongly believe that when our economy recovers, in their words, business will go back to business as usual. So what would that tell us? That right in this moment, that consumers are not trusting how we're conducting business, and whether or not we're on this question or not, the fact that they have cited this, that yes, maybe they're going to be doing some things in this moment to help us believe that they've learned along with us. As soon as this thing gets fixed, they're going to go right back to the way they've done things before. And so this is a question that, you know, we would say absolutely needs to get addressed for obvious reasons. At the same time, at almost every market, what we don't see enough of is that there are companies that are making a difference in building trusted brands. They have customers that are loyal, their sales are increasing, and their future looks pretty bright. What is consistent about these companies is they are not conducting business as usual. They are making positive ripples, and each one of those responses is having its own effect in a much different direction. So these are companies, some of which you saw in our study in context today, like Tom's Shoes, Hyundai, Apple, and Domino's Pizza. So Tom's Shoes makes it easy to give. I love that model. All you have to do is buy a pair of shoes. You click with your credit card, and it lets you know that you've just given a pair of shoes to a child who doesn't have any. They've just announced their millionth pair of shoes to a child in need, and I think that's pretty commendable. Hyundai has made it easy to buy a car, promising that if you join the ranks of unemployment, you can return that car without any fear of your credit rating being affected or the concern that other household expenses that are vital to the livelihood of your family will be compromised. Apple decided to forge a stronger bond with their customers through the creation of the retail outlets, and they have continued, even in this turbulent, low-trust environment, to thrive. And Domino's Pizza happens to be one of my favorites. They, in the face of their YouTube debacle, rebounded in the marketplace, basically by reformulating their entire product line and humbly apologizing that they ignored their customers and sold terrible pizza. So when we refer to these moves, and by the way, there are many moves, and these are just 4 examples that we're citing today, what do we mean when we say that these positive ripple effects are the trust moves that are going to start to make a difference? Tom's Shoes is frequently cited in the media as a new kind of organization, a giving organization that serves a mission, but is also turning a very healthy profit. Entrepreneurs and established organizations alike are now examining this model to see how it might be leveraged and how they look to bring their products and services to market. Hyundai didn't just understand the economic concern of their customers, they grabbed hold of it. And they partnered with them to mitigate that obstacle of I can't afford to buy a car right now. And this went far beyond the enticement of rebates or low interest financing. In fact, probably didn't even have to lean into those too much. The result was increased sales at a time that other automobile manufacturers were struggling to survive. It is interesting, if any of you are following sort of what's happened to the people who invented that for Hyundai, that they have a new ripple of their own, and that GM has poached the 2 top marketing executives of Hyundai. So it'll be fascinating to watch the kinds of initiatives that come out of GM that could be forging new bonds based in empathy. Apple, we always just say, well, as Apple. So we don't know one organization who wouldn't want to have their customer loyalty or their bottom line these days. Their new product launches always make waves in the market. Their retail strategy now is being picked up by Microsoft. But it'll be interesting to watch theirs. They have hired a 27-year veteran of Walmart to lead that initiative. So we'll be seeing with a lot of curiosity whether or not that will result in the customer relationship as the focus or whether a pricing strategy will reign. Domino's Pizza is enjoying increased sales and a lot of media attention, essentially by putting their CEO out in front and dishing his entire product. And also promising that he will now in the future only create products and services that their customers will buy. And at the risk of dating myself just a bit, this has a striking resemblance to a move that Lee Iacocca made in 1979 when he told us that Chrysler made lousy products. So the question here, and if you look at Domino's Pizza, is that pebble continuing to create ripples in the right direction? A couple of other interesting in contrast to some of the positives, if we look at, is the contrast with a few other ripples. In testimony before the U.S. Congress, in terms of how things are rippling across entire industries, after the BP debacle, ExxonMobil came out and made a strong acknowledgement that the entire oil industry, not British Petroleum, the entire oil industry had let down the American people, and the American people no longer have confidence. And as my daughter told me as I read this to her last night, it's not a good thing to lose confidence. The New York Times, everyone's been following sort of the egg outbreak and the resistance to increased legislation for more government oversight and sort of what that would cost and what that would mean in terms of making that happen. On September 18th in the New York Times, food manufacturers are now lining up to support legislation for increased government oversight because, as they state, they are tired of being punished for the sloppiness of others. And they are even willing to pay a fraction of what it could cost to bring that government in for increased oversight. So I have two questions that I'd like to ask you to ask yourselves today, and people that you would know around you. And that is, would you know how ripples are affecting your organization, the brands that you're working on, or even how the brands you're working on could be affecting your organization? And the other critical question would be, would you know where the vulnerabilities are if you would understand the first question? Companies creating positive ripple effects are not perfect, but the moves they are making to address the trust challenges are consistently correct. They are making positive ripples, and each one of those is creating an effect of its own. There's, at the most basic fundamental, and I don't mean to simplify here, but there is one thing. If you look at the companies that are thriving in this turbulent, low-trust environment, there's one thing that they all have in common, and is that they have made a commitment to really listen. And this is not sort of the listening that we're all used to. They are really leaning into what it is they have not been hearing. They have now included trust as a line on their spreadsheets and baked it into their business models as something that's important to invest in, not as sort of a corner of the company that needs to understand where their trust score sits, but how is it that once they understand where their vulnerabilities are and how the ripples could be affecting them, what is it they have to do on a consistent basis across the entire organization to be sure that they're able to build a stronger trust base and to sustain it. Trust is a basic survival move. It is hardwired into human consciousness, and this is why there is reason to be hugely optimistic. People want to trust. And even if you were to ask, even though the trust levels are low, it's not that we don't have any trust. So some people will say, well, we could argue there is no trust. You either have it or you don't. People are, I would say, are sitting on the fence and they're sort of wondering which way to go. They can't quite trust enough for us to see a dramatic effect in our economic recovery, but they're not willing to say that they're not willing to rebound in how they trust. We tend to focus a great deal on the breakdowns and the trust breakers, but trust always seems ready to want to come back and to rebound. There are many companies who are beating the trends more and more of not falling into sort of the low trust scores and sort of the area of let's just wait to see what happens. As soon as this is over, deep, big breath, I don't have to worry about this anymore. They are thriving in this turbulent, low trust environment, and the goal for us would be to be one of them. What's really interesting is that as we start to become more observant of the ripples, our eye is pulled farther out into the horizon, and we start to contemplate the long-range impact of our behaviors and our trust moves. And really important is that we become much more aware and alert of the ripples that could be coming toward us that are created by others, but that we know we're going to have to address, and that we would be in shape to strategically drop a pebble of our own. As more and more companies get this right, we will create enough positive ripple effects to carry the day and possibly even the next decade. Does anyone have any questions? So, I hope what we've been able to give you, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we need to get going with the one-on-one interview, is that while we have a severe situation on our hand, there are many, many examples of companies who are getting it right, and I think good examples for us all to look at and understand how to emulate. So right now I'd like to go right to the one-on-one interview with Chris Cuomo and the former governor of Illinois, Rod Blagojevich. And you know, what seems more appropriate than to have this important interview here today than to have the person who serves as one of our, someone we wake up to almost every morning on Good Morning America. If I could just, without further ado, bring Rod and Chris to the stage.
So what we'll do here is the governor and I will lay out the obvious, and you'll get to hear the governor's take about where he is now, how he got here, what it all means. And then early on, the governor would like to open it up to all of you to kind of motivate the conversation from there going forward. Does that work for everybody? Beautiful. Silence as acceptance. So, Governor, let's begin with the obvious. Ad week, advertising, brand, what it means. Who are you now as a brand? What are you selling?
Well, I'm selling my innocence. Right now I'm still trying to convince everybody and anybody who's willing to listen that the accusations that have been leveled against me aren't true, that I did nothing wrong, didn't violate any laws, just went through a long trial, and on every one of the alleged corruption charges, the government failed to prove any corruption. So it's in the big war, it's a significant step in the right direction. However, they've said that they want to do the case again. So I'm still in the middle of essentially trying to get on top of any mountaintop I can find to say that it ain't so, I didn't do it. And so essentially, to the extent that you consider this as a branding issue, it's more with regard to me, my reputation, my integrity, and everything I've worked my whole life to try to establish has been under attack and under assault, and still is.
So what is the brand message? Is it, I am who I was before? You know, what do you want people to accept and acknowledge? Because you're obviously trying to create a commodity there as well, right? You're on The Apprentice. After here, you're going to shoot a national campaign, right? A national commercial ad campaign. So you're trying to sell yourself as what?
Well, you know, Chris, that's a good question. When something like this happens, and you've been the governor of the fifth biggest state, and then you've been caught up in allegations relating to accusations that are not true, but the whole world's been told that you're trying to sell the President of the United States a Senate seat for financial gain, and that after you wake up, the damage has been done because they've done this, and they've done what Winston Churchill said. You know, you can a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its pants on, and then you've got to figure out a way to kind of crawl out of bed and tell everybody, I just didn't do these things, and give me a chance to prove it. But then you have a system in place where, you know, the court process takes years for this to happen, and then you have to rebuild one step at a time. The Celebrity Apprentice with Donald Trump, the commercial that I'm going to shoot in LA, while branding is certainly a part of it, my motivation, Chris, quite frankly, is I have to make a living. And when the government comes after you and they do what they do, one of the tactics that they use is they try to squeeze you financially. And they try to bludgeon you and put you in a position where you can't fight anymore. And as a result of that, they want you to come in and acknowledge or admit to things that you didn't do so that they can chalk up another victory and get themselves a big trophy, which is what I contend is the motivation behind this prosecution of me.
So unpack this for me as a notion. Does it matter whether or not the charges are real? Does it matter in politics anymore? Do you think people will ever believe you as to whether or not something is true about you? And do you think ultimately it will affect your ability to sell yourself going forward?
That's a great question, Chris.
It's only kind of ask.
Well, yes. Well, it's an unfolding story. I don't know that I have the answer completely. I can tell you that on December the 9th, 2008, at 6 o'clock in the morning, when the FBI and the government was in my house arresting me as a sitting governor, and then would lock me up because of their motivation and their strategic imperative, and then a press conference was given by the prosecutor saying he was stopping a crime spree before it happened, and Abraham Lincoln would roll over in his grave, and this is the worst corruption spree he's ever seen, yet they tried the case. We never even put a defense on, and on all the corruption charges, there were no convictions. Having said that, when they do that to you, and then the media is caught up in this with a super sensational circumstance, and it's the President of the United States, the President-elect's Senate seat, which now becomes an international story, you got a lot of crawling and digging out of a mess to try to get your reputation back. I think we've come a long way. I've come a long way in terms of being able to assert my innocence, and it's very different today than it was on December the 10th and 11th and 12th when all this happened. I was walking down the streets in Times Square yesterday, and a couple of New York police officers came up to me and were congratulating me on the trial, and it was very gratifying to see that they liked the fact that, you know, one guy could stand up to the power in the system. And I really believe, and this goes, I think, to branding, and I think this is what happens when your product is under assault. If you believe in your product, and I certainly believe in the truth of what my circumstances are, that I did nothing wrong, that my intent was honest, that I acted in good faith, then if you listen to a lot of the traditional lawyers, they'll say, don't say anything, because anything you say, they'll come and use that against you in a court of law. On the other hand, your common sense tells you, and then your desire, if you're honest and truthful, is that you want the people to know you didn't do these things. And so contrary to your lawyer's advice, I went out and did a whole bunch of television shows, did Good Morning America, shortly after this all happened, and a bunch of others, asserting my innocence. And in fact, one of my top lawyers quit because he felt this was not the way to defend yourself. But had I not done that, had I not protected my reputation by fighting back, the brand, if you will, if you're considering this in the case of merchandising and products, I think the first press conference, the accusations, all that stuff would have stuck in a way where there wasn't somebody saying he didn't do it. And if you ask yourself, people out in the audience who ask themselves, if you've been accused of something you didn't do, wouldn't you have this desire and this need to go out and tell everybody you didn't do it, as opposed to just listening to what your lawyers say, which is don't say anything. So I think when your product is under assault and you believe in it, you need to fight back and stand up. Don't take flight, but fight. And in this case, that's what I did, and I think it's part of the process of rebuilding my reputation as well as my life.
Early on in covering that trial, you quoted the Bible. What was it, John 8:32, right? The truth will set you free. Famous expression, everybody knows it. And there was a big debate about, this looked like a slam dunk. The wired calls were damning, it seemed, on the face of them. And you kept saying from the beginning, I did nothing illegal. So, apropos of this discussion, the idea that politics is a dirty game, it is a horse trading game, is that these things are used as tokens. I've got an open seat, you want something, I should get something. That came out in this trial more than the legalities. The question is, was this really about legal, illegal, or was this just an unusually insightful look into what politics is about? Forget about the law. Forget about the 23 or the 24 counts that they didn't get you on. Bottom line, politics is an ugly game, and the horse trading you were doing, you believe, was just a legitimate part of the business. True?
Well, I would say yes, and there's more to it. I freely and openly spoke on the telephone with lawyers and top staffers and world-class political consultants who do presidential campaigns. about a whole variety of ideas with regard to what you can and can't do with the Senate seat. We discussed a whole bunch of ideas, crazy ones. What about Oprah Winfrey for the Senate, which I thought was a pretty good idea, because you can't buy her. She's got more of a bully pulpit than any other U.S. senator, and she probably more than anybody helped make Obama president. Some advisors didn't think that was a good idea. I thought it was a great idea. Then we talked about how you approach her. We talked about whether or not I should see if there's an ambassadorship available. Not that I really sincerely thought I was going to get that, but let's look and see what the options are. Let's talk about ideas, good, bad, ugly, stupid. Let's brainstorm and do it openly on the telephone with your staffers and lawyers. And not a single one of them ever said, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that, that's not legal. They said, hey, it's stupid. They'll never make you ambassador to the Court of St. James, or you know, you're not going to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services and all the rest. But no one, and rightfully said it's illegal. In politics, and your dad certainly understood this as governor, Abraham Lincoln, who your dad obviously is a tremendous fan of, and I've read your dad's books, and he quotes Lincoln so much and has written books about Lincoln himself. But Abraham Lincoln knew that good government is good politics, and good politics is good government, and that the ways to serve the people, to get things done for people in our imperfect system, is through political horse trading. And you wish, and I used to, as governor, wish I could just go to the legislative leaders and say, hey, look, this is the right thing to do for children. Let's give them health care. Why do I have to trade something for that? And yet, the way the business works is, that's how it operates. And
But
so,
even on the ugly side of it, do you think you were prosecuted for the reality of the business? You're saying, is this guy going to get this contract? What has he done for my campaign? You know, Obama's people want me to do something with this Senate seat. What are they going to give me? You know, it's mine to dispose of.
Right.
It may smell bad to people,
Right.
but bottom line, when you were asking for those things, you're no dope. You're an attorney. You worked your way through the system. That's what it is. It may not look nice. We may not like to see it. You know, what's the old expression? The sausage being made.
that's right.
But that's the reality, right? You had the Senate seat. They had somebody they wanted. As you said in your own words, you weren't giving it away for nothing.
Well, and again, this is discussions with my staff, my immediate team, that didn't really go beyond that. And other than some probing with some labor leader who was a close friend of President Obama's and mine, and I should point out that he came to me and he testified that the president sent him to me to see, you know, what I might be interested in doing with regard to a candidate he wanted for the United States Senate. They came to me with those ideas. Rahm Emanuel and I are on those tape conversations talking about a variety of different options. On the day before my arrest, and this is what I've challenged the government, I'd like to do it again. They should agree with me. Release every tape conversation. There's 2,000 telephone calls with me. I say play them all publicly. Have every FBI interview of everybody that was interviewed by the FBI and all the evidence. Release it publicly. Generally speaking, the government, and they're the ones who got this evidence, Chris, they're trying to keep the evidence from being heard. I'm the one they're throwing it all at, and I'm saying good, bad, and ugly, and I apologize for the profanity. Again, I didn't know the government was listening to my telephone conversations, and I should probably not say the MF word as often as I did, or some of these other words. That's a lesson that I've learned from this experience. But having said that, I have said play all the tapes publicly and release all the evidence publicly. And I'll say this now, I'll challenge the prosecutors. I will go to court and instruct my lawyers, if they'll agree, to give the media all of the evidence in these cases, all the FBI interviews, all of the taped conversations, so you can see the full story as it unfolds. This process began at the end of October 2008. They arrested me on December the 9th of 2008. On the day before my arrest, and this prosecutor said he was stopping a crime spree before it happened, the reality is Rahm Emanuel, the president's new chief of staff, had agreed to be the go-between between me and the Democratic House Speaker in Illinois in exchange for me appointing his daughter, the Attorney General, to the United States Senate. That speaker was going to support and not block a public works bill that would create 500,000 jobs, expand health care to another 100,000 to 300,000 people, working people who couldn't afford it, and a written promise not to raise taxes. And then all of a sudden, as it's all lined up, they arrest me the next morning, and it's very suspicious. And I would say, if you see the evidence, you'll see that what I'm saying is truthful. The government refuses to have you hear that evidence, and when we offered to play that stuff in court, they've objected to even talking about routine politics as a way to explain what my intent was.
Okay, so that basically lays out the baseline for all of you, right? And if you're thinking about brand identity and establishing it, especially where politics is involved, everybody says they want to be a change agent. Everybody says they're going to be different. And then we see more and more of what happened with the governor. So what do you got? What are your questions for the governor? You convinced them all, boy. They should have, if this had been the jury, you would have been all set. Madam, up there.
Well, I think generally people have a general mistrust of people in politics generally to begin with. And then when you've been the governor like I was, and then you've been arrested in such a public way and accused of corruption in such a public way, that puts you in a very big deficit with regard to public trust. And part of what I've tried to explain here is that in terms of the branding of it, and I don't see myself as a product, I see myself as a guy who's been wrongfully accused of things I didn't do with the honorable intent, not the wrong intent. I'm fighting back to try to clear my name and preserve my my liberty, not to mention the fact that my whole life has been about the things that my parents taught me, the values they taught me. That's at stake here. My little girls and their future, that's at stake here. What their dad is and what he stands for, all that is part of this process. And you guys might consider that branding. I consider it just one person trying to get the truth out. But when you're accused like that, of course people will generally think it's true, especially if it's a politician that gets accused. And unfortunately, we have a system that theoretically says you're innocent until proven guilty. But in the media age that we live in the super sensational hype that goes along with it, and when you have a prosecutor with the power that they have, because they can just come in and do what they do, with the discretion that they have, and I should point out, they are public servants as well, but they're not elected and not accountable to really anybody. And I would argue that my case is a poster child for the reforms that are necessary to put a check and balance on some of these prosecutors who are using their offices for their own political agenda, because it's a big deal if they can get a big name and get a big trophy.
To the woman's point, though, do you think it would have helped you if you had said, look, did I do something illegal? I say, no, I'll fight that all day long. Is this ugly, and was I wrong to be trying to get personal gain from my public office? Yes, but that's the game. A little bit of a confession, clear of the indictment, but conceding what seemed obvious to the rest of us, which is this guy's making a play here to fill his pockets, because that's what they do, these politicians.
Hold on, Chris. If I did that, then I would deserve to be convicted, because that would be illegal. If you're trying to get personal financial gain in exchange for your public duty, that is against the law. And I never did any of that. That's not anything that we talked about.
Pondering his ideas.
Thinking out loud on whether or not there's a cabinet position available, whether or not you might want to consider, can you be an ambassador? I mean, I even said my chance of being an ambassador to anything, frankly, when you're governor, that's a much better job than being an ambassador. But let's explore what's out there. I joked and said they won't even offer me ambassador to Macedonia. They sold it to the people. They sold it to the people that I was selling that Senate seat for money. And that's just a flat-out lie. And there's no conversation or tape or anything that proves anything like that. They quoted me saying, this is quote-unquote effing golden, and I'm not giving it up for nothing. But they don't tell you all the things that go on after that statement and before that statement, but they let you think that I'm saying in the next line, there's $5 million in a Swiss bank account, then I'll make Obama senator, which is not at all true. So have I acknowledged bad conversations, dumb conversations, the use of profanity? It's undeniable. But none of that's illegal. And again, had I known that the government was listening to my telephone calls, I would have not sworn.
Is anybody out there offended by the profanity? Is that what piqued anybody's interest in that situation? You bunch of cursors. Who else?
What a fucking relief.
Who has you should run for governor of New York. Sir, on the side, do you have a question?
No, I'm talking about the prosecutors, the government prosecutors. And to your question, were they targeting me? Absolutely. For 5-6 years, they were targeting me. 179 FBI agents asking anybody they could find whether or not I gambled, which I don't. Do I do drugs, which I don't. Do I cheat on my wife, which I don't. I'm devoted to her and I love her. They use your taxpayer dollars finding that stuff out. They made a decision at some point to try to get me. And they've done this at different times. And I felt like this is all part of the process. That you get the bigger office, you just got to live with these new realities. I mean, there isn't any, the Clintons have gone through this. When they were, First Lady and President Clinton had to go through significant investigations from his years as governor. And a lot of that, I believe, was driven by this new politics. This prosecutor It's bipartisan. Went after the Bush administration, Cheney and Scooter Libby, and they went over after Libby on a whole bunch of stuff, and the stuff that they thought he did with regard to releasing secrets and information, there was nothing there.
But just because you can't prove it doesn't mean that there is not intrigue afoot, right? I mean, this is a high bar when you're going to go into court.
Yeah.
If they had if all this had come out, if some wily, scroungy reporter such as myself had got their hand on these tapes, that would have been a public forum trial that you almost certainly would have taken a beating at. This is a much higher standard, proving criminality. It doesn't mean that it's right or good for the rest of us.
It's humiliating. It's embarrassing, some of these conversations. They're not illegal. They're, in fact, again, it's me asking for advice. And there's a smoking gun in the tape that the government even played, Chris, and it was this. I talked about an idea, and I'm coming up with creative thoughts. Before you act on these things, I want to bounce it off my advisors to see if they make any sense or not. The way to get things done in government sometimes is you got to think outside the box. The way you do business successfully is sometimes you think outside the box. And so you want to throw out every possible idea you can come up with, and a lot of them are stupid, but some of them you land and get a good one. We have, in Illinois, when I was governor, we gave all of our senior citizens free public transportation. And I found a way around the legislature to do that because I thought outside the box. So I felt with the Senate seat, I'm going to think about a variety of considerations and openly with my staff and lawyers and political advisors, bounce them off of them to see what they thought. And what the government, the prosecutors did was they took a lot of the stuff out of context and didn't give you the full context and led you to hear some of these conversations that are certainly unflattering. But again, when you're intending to do things honestly, why would you talk? You honestly just talk to your staff about these ideas. If I felt that these things were somehow inappropriate or illegal, I wouldn't be talking to them openly. And in one of the tape conversations the government played, I threw out an idea on whether or not we could raise, Obama could help us, President Obama could help us raise money from Bill Gates and George Soros, Warren Buffett, some of these billionaires, put it into a 501c4 not-profit organization where we can use that, and I can use that, to go out and expand, try to help expand healthcare for people who otherwise can't afford it.
Well, it's also suggested that you were hoping that they could fund it, and then when you got out of office, you could run it and make some cash.
It could be a place where I might work when I'm no longer governor, but hold it. The former governors generally are going to do pretty good working. I'm a lawyer, and you can work in a big corporate firm and do, pretty darn good. I'm looking to see whether or not there's a way where I can play a role in some of these issues that I cared about. When I was governor, we were the first state in America to give every child access to health care. So health care was an issue that I cared deeply about, and I wanted to see if there's a way where I could play a role with the Obama administration to do it. And so I threw this idea out. And I talked to this advisor, and I said, it's got to be, and I'm quoting me from the tapes, legal, obviously. And then I said, is this something that can be done? And he said, yeah, it happens all the time.
But isn't that what hurts politics as a brand? Is that at the end of the day, we may not want to acknowledge it, but from these people's perspective of, the idea of what the strength of a brand is, there is money, and it's all over the place. And people that can't, sitting politicians like you are trying to figure out how they'll make money when they get out, who's going to donate to my campaign so I can win because I need the money to beat the next guy, and that's the reality of the game. And when you people run, you all say the opposite. You were a change agent. Everybody's a change. Obama was a change agent. We're not going to play any games. I'm not going to be for sale. But is that why the brand is so unbelievable? Because the reality is, once you're in there, money is at play.
Look, is there a correlation between the role of money and winning elections? That's undeniable. You, of course, know that. I know that. It's funny how the media sometimes plays things. When U.S. Senator Barack Obama was running and was the underdog in the beginning of the race against U.S. Senator Hillary Clinton from New York, he was able to establish his political bona fides in that race by the fact that he was able to raise a whole bunch of money. And that was being used as a badge of honor. In fact, President Obama raised more money, $1 billion, in his presidential campaign than anybody in American history. So to the extent that money has a role in politics, that's undeniable. And if you raise it legally within the rules, that's how the system works. Can there be a better way of doing it? Absolutely. You and I chatted briefly before we came on the stage about taxpayers, public funding of campaigns and elections would significantly change how government operates. Because the pharmaceutical industry, for example, wouldn't be as powerful. The tobacco industry wouldn't have as much influence. And the reality is congressmen and senators, are mindful of these contributors when it comes to the legislation that they draft. In fact, as a U.S. Congressman for 6 years, I can tell you, Chris, that a lot of the very legislation that is drafted by senators and congressmen are drafted with these very lobbyists in the room, mostly doing the work themselves, and then they get these congressmen and senators to be the sponsors of these bills. It's not illegal. It's certainly unappealing and unattractive. It's among the imperfections of our system, and I believe ought to be changed.
The idea of perception is reality. What was your take on the Resco situation? Resco was hung around your neck like a 1,000-pound weight. When the information came out about the mortgages and the house and Obama, it seemed that the media gave the Obamas somewhat more of a light treatment than you were getting. What was your take on that?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons why that was the case. Barack Obama was running for president. He was a very strong candidate and was emerging as a front runner in the Democratic field. And then after he won the nomination, as a very likely possible president. And so he was in a different place at that time than I was as a second-term governor. Approval ratings were low. Everybody was angry at people in politics back in the fall of 2008. The mortgage crisis, the financial crisis collapsed our economy. And so that certainly helped Obama get elected, but it also left those of us who were in office with bad approval ratings. And then the media, likes to fix on a story, and they basically assigned Resco to me. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of...
Do you think the media wanted to keep the image, the brand of Obama somewhat less sullied? Because you could have spent all day on that, right? I mean, there was a mortgage, there was paper, there were values, there were objective ways to look at something as being fundamentally graft.
I think that I think there was a decision somewhere that Resco should be hung around my neck, and Obama's on to do bigger and better things, and going to make history, which he did as the first African-American president. And I'm not so sure that isn't a trade-off worth making in the big scheme of things, to have Barack Obama elected president, first African-American president, what that means to our country today and tomorrow and our future, what it says to little children growing up in African-American communities where hope and opportunity have not been in big supply, to see that one day he will be president. I suspect, I believe that's a greater good that's served, and so to me to have to wear Resco a little bit more unfairly, I'm willing to do it. Now, do you privately vent sometimes because and I'm not at all suggesting that there's anything improper with regard to President Obama and Tony Resco, but I will say that the government and the media has certainly accused me, and in fact convicted me in so many ways of guilt by association with this guy, Tony Resco.
Blagojevich as martyr. I like that. That's a good little brand spin you got going there. What else do you have for the governor? Young lady.
Well, again, I still have this big albatross. We got through the first trial, and that was good, but not perfect. Now I have to do it again because they want to try it again, and so I'm still in this period of wilderness as we prepare for the trial in January. And again, when the government comes after you, they make it very hard for you to earn a living. And I don't blame some of my old friends and supporters that when I call Chris, they're afraid somebody else is listening. So they don't really want to have that conversation. And a lot of people fear these prosecutors. You should take a look at USA Today's cover story today about misconduct by prosecutors, prosecutorial abuse, and some of the ethical failings with the modern prosecutor today. But to answer your question, I wrote a book and tried to put my story out as much as I could in that book. Took me 2 boxes of crayons to actually write that book. But it's done, and some people actually bought it. And as often as I can, I try to get out there and tell as much of the stories I possibly can. But you're going to hear me say it over and over again. The proof is really in what the facts and the evidence is. They played less than 2% of the tapes in that trial. Again, we didn't put on a defense because we felt they didn't prove any corruption, and they didn't, and the jury agreed with that. Having said that, we were prepared, and I was expecting to testify, and that we were going to be able to play a lot more of the tapes. The government objected. When I challenged the government to play every tape, the good and the bad, the ugly, the stupid, and the unattractive, they objected to that. and the judge ruled in their favor. And so I'm renewing my challenge that all those tapes should be played either in court or released to the media, and all of the evidence gathered in the case, all the witnesses who've testified, all the witnesses who were interviewed by the FBI, from President Obama to Rahm Emanuel to Harry Reid to Senator Menendez to my staff to my deputy governor, to all of them should be released to the public. One of the things that was clear in the case was this. Some testimony was brought out by some of the witnesses. Initially, when the FBI went to their house, and they do this in a way that scares people. They show up at 6 o'clock in the morning at your house. The FBI agents are there. And there's a big contractor who's there with a sick wife, and he testified in court that when he first got there, you know, they asked him, was the governor pressuring you for campaign contributions? And the guy said, no, there was no pressure, he just asked me. And incidentally, they never came through with those contributions. There was no pressure. Then they got him to say some things that apparently he said something because he was afraid that was not truthful. If you say something not truthful to an FBI agent, that you can be charged with a crime. They then threatened him with charging him with a crime. He then changed his story. All of a sudden, he felt pressure from me. If you see all the evidence and the interviews of the witnesses, you'll see a pattern. How initially, when the first interview happens, these people are just fine. Governor asked me if he could make a contribution, and we said we'd look at it. I didn't feel any pressure, but after they've been talked to a few more times, their minds have been changed, and they changed their stories. So I really believe the big story here, moving forward, is if I'm telling the truth will be borne out by the evidence, and I say it should be released, not only all of it in court, it ought to be released publicly.
So is your salvation ever going to be found in court, or do you think maybe, to the young lady's point, you should become a change agent and say, look, I know the game, I was playing a game, everybody else plays it, the game needs to change. Money changes hands, people get contracts because of how generous they are to the people who are in government at the time. It happens. And now I know that, and you all know I know, so I'm going to be a change agent. Action in a positive way, as opposed to fighting a battle of semantics about a lawsuit that most people won't really be able to get through and probably won't judge fairly.
That's an excellent point. Look, when we prevail in this case the next time around, and I'm vindicated, which I fully expect will be the case, am I going to renew my life to a variety of different things based on this experience? The answer is absolutely yes. Among the things I'm going to do is I'm going to look to others who've been falsely accused of things, who don't have the bully pulpit that I've been blessed with. And again, I wouldn't wish this on anybody. It's a double-edged sword. You've got media reporters and media trucks and TV trucks surrounding your home. You have little girls who are going to school. Your whole world has been collapsed on you because you've been accused of these terrible things. That's the bad side of it. On the other hand is you get a chance to go out there and talk to people and express your innocence. There are thousands of people across our country who have been falsely accused of things they didn't do. There's a socioeconomic component to this. A lot of poor people who can't fight back. And what I'd like to do is to devote some of what I do in the future to getting some of those cases out in the public eye so we can see it. But I would say one more thing, and I think your dad would appreciate this. The Founding Fathers, when they set up our country in the late 18th century, they envisioned a system of checks and balances, that the executive branch wouldn't be so powerful so that power corrupts absolutely. It would be checked by a legislative branch. That's the Congress and the senators. There would be a judicial branch that would check both the legislative branch and the executive branch, the Congress and the president, the state legislators, and the governor. What they did not, there'd be a free media, the fourth estate, that would check the judicial, the executive, and the legislative. What nobody envisioned was these prosecutors with unfettered power, appointed, politically appointed, and this was, these prosecutors were President Bush's appointees, politically appointed, who are out there trying to make names for themselves, going after big targets, and using that power to intimidate, to scare, and to compel witnesses to say certain things that are simply not true. And then when they bring that kind of power and resources to bear, and the media likes the news stories, but even in this particular case, this prosecutor locked up a New York Times reporter in the Scooter Libby case because she wouldn't give up her source. She sat in jail for 80-something days. When you get that kind of power, who checks that? Nobody checks that. And that, but I think, you worry about money in politics, you're not willing to have that fear. But I think the bigger fear to our democracy is these powerful prosecutors who can do this sort of thing to even a governor of the fifth biggest state in America. If they can do that to me, imagine what they do to ordinary people that choose to do that.
So to start off, I want to say the mantra for the past couple of years, coming from you guys and internet companies around privacy, has been self-regulation. It will save us, and it's the way to go. I think lately I've been hearing more skepticism from regulators, from advertisers, from consumers about if it is the way to go. Would love to hear your thoughts on that, and if you wanted to predict a little bit about what we might see in the next year coming out of Washington, that would be great. Take them in any order.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you pointed out, I've been doing privacy work at Yahoo for 12 years now, and I think, if you look back at the last 2 years in that time frame alone, the self-regulatory movement has really gained a lot of steam, and in a very significant way if you actually look at the things that companies are doing. But I don't think there's a single company that would say that privacy legislation or regulation is unlikely. I think most of us view it as an inevitability. I think the real question is, can you interplay self-regulation? Can you weave that through and do so in a way that continues to really promote innovation and in a way that won't stifle innovation? Technology moves at a very, very rapid pace. And a few years ago, we weren't tweeting, we weren't talking about social networking, we weren't doing a lot of things. And I think the real challenge for legislation is going to be to be drafted in a way that gives businesses an opportunity to really continue to innovate and change and grow at the pace of technology.
And based on, you guys are all in Washington, probably a huge chunk of time if you're not based there. I mean, based on what you're seeing in conversations, what sense are you getting about the direction the next round will go? I mean, do you think there's, and if the more specifics the better in terms of how you want to see that balance struck and if it will happen?
Well, I think we've seen some proposed legislation. We've seen a couple of specific bills that have been either introduced or discussed in draft form. The Senate is looking at this as well. There's been conversations about do not track lists. There's been a lot of conversation about that. But I think what's really interesting is when you listen to Director Vladeck from the Federal Trade Commission, he's been talking a lot about things that I think are things we can do right off the bat and things we've already been doing. For example, the notion of privacy in particular, most websites have privacy policies and a lot of privacy disclosures. But what we've all been trying to do, and I think Yahoo's been doing this quite well for the last year, is to contextualize those notices, to take a lot of information and rather than put it in one document that someone has to navigate to, take it and make it contextual to the user interaction, provide the type of transparency and control in the user engagement, which really means threading privacy throughout your products and services in a thoughtful way and not looking at it as something that you just kind of post in a document somewhere. So that kind of interactivity is the sort of thing that I think the Federal Trade Commission is looking for, and the sort of thing that actually makes the user experience more engaging overall.
Mike, what do you, I mean, I think that there has been a lot of, every couple days I have a privacy policy that's being clarified, sent to me, or, decrypted in some way. Is there any talk among, what's the talk among folks about examining back-end data and retention policies? I mean, we've seen some of that in the EU over the years, and well, obviously the search logs is a big issue too, but I mean, is that something that's under consideration right now, sort of, not how clear your privacy policy is, but what behind the scenes is happening to the data?
Yeah, I think that's a big focus right now, actually. A lot of criticism has been raised in the past years about the effectiveness of privacy policies. I mean, people have said they're written by lawyers, including some up here on the stage, and that they're hard to read, hard to discern. And the fact is that you can put a lot of work into drafting a really clear, really consumable, really understandable privacy statement. But what all of the companies on this stage do is complicated. And the data flows and what's collected and how it's collected is complicated. And at the end of the day, very few people are going to read those privacy policies. So I think people have rightfully said that even for those people who aren't going to take the time to read the privacy policies and make the most informed decisions about the products and services they're using online, those people's privacy still needs to be protected. And that's where you get to sort of the back end things. What are you collecting? How are you minimizing the privacy impact of that in a way that's consistent with business needs? What are the data retention timeframes? What are the anonymization methods? What's the data security around the data you're collecting? All those things are critically important, and you need to think about that along with transparency and privacy notices as part of an overall privacy program.
Would you guys, and anyone can jump into this, I mean, do you think you all have similar or the same policies on that front? I mean, if it's, for very complicated, and I also imagine it's where you get into some of the technology advantages in managing this data. I mean, pipe up if you think you guys do something better than the other guy on that front.
I just want to point out, I'm not going to say that what we do better, but I will say that it has become a marketing, a part of our marketing. It's part of our consumer outreach. So, I mean, we are all on this stage very much user-facing companies, and we live and die by whether people trust our brand and come to our services and want to interact with us. There are certainly people out there who don't have that consideration, and they might be more free to push the limits in ways that we can't. So when we sort of take upon ourselves things about how long we'll store our logs, for instance, or what kind of controls we'll offer that are above and beyond what are required by law, that's us trying to say to our users, this is what we're doing there to establish that trust and maintain that relationship. And we are competitive on that way. We want to point out how ours is better than the guy down the street, because, you know, I mean, it's not that hard if a user wants to say, well, you know, I'm not happy with this relationship that I have with this provider. These guys offer a pretty good service. I'm just going to walk over here and go to this website instead.
This really comes back. I'm sorry. This really comes back. Is this on? Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm sorry. This really comes back to your first question, Jessica, about government regulation versus self-regulation. I think Will is absolutely correct in saying that all the companies up here are very public-facing. They're, you know, it's not like the other 15, 18 other companies that can sometimes be involved in providing an internet activity for people, where there's ads being served. There's people doing analytics. At least with Facebook, you're just there with Facebook. Other point, which I think is really important, is this. We think we are being regulated every single day by our users. If they come back the next day, that means that they had a good experience, probably.
We all know that users might not. I mean, it is true that, and you guys in particular know your users pipe up when they're not happy. But I think everyone, and I imagine friends at the FTC and such things, you know, aren't going to leave it up to 500 million people, you know, some of whom with various levels of sophistication to know what's happening, particularly when we get into the back end stuff. So I guess that was just sort of a rebuttal, not a question. But I
disagree.
Okay, so I mean, then Tim, what do you think would be feasible in terms of regulation from folks in Canada, Europe, the US? What would you guys be comfortable with and sort of seeing from them?
Oh, that's an interesting question. We really believe that our users know best what they want. They believe in freedom, they believe in ownership, and they want control over their data. So any regulatory structure that is imposed on the existing systems or other companies that are out there, I think have to respond to those consumer wants and desires. We're certainly, I think all four companies up here, trying to meet those needs. We want to give people the freedom to speak. We want them to know that they have ownership of their data, not just for a little while, but in perpetuity. And we want them to know that they've got control over that data. And so our systems are designed to foster those three goals. And any regulatory system that's out there, whether it be here in the United States, Canada, Europe, et cetera, should recognize these are the consumer demands that are out there. And these are the consumer demands that the companies are trying to meet, and should give flexibility for those things to occur.
I think it's important also to note that privacy is not an absolute, in the sense that what is, and certainly you just only have to go on Facebook for 10 seconds to realize that, you know, based on what people share, everyone has a different idea of what privacy means to them. And so I think in that spirit, you want to give consumers control over their experience to assert what is the right level of privacy for them. Privacy is one big component of trust, but at the end of the day, trust, especially from a website perspective, has a lot to do with, does the product work? You know, is the email server up? Am I getting what I expect? And am I really able to control my experience and make it what I want? And I think that's important. No negative surprises. There's no such thing as a good privacy surprise. So it's about that expectations management and empowering the consumers to customize the experience to be appropriate to their level of privacy.
I saw Will chuckle too, so we're going to get to the privacy surprise you're chuckling about. But Mike, sorry, jump in.
I was just going to say that, you know, I think in terms of legislation, I think, you know, what Anne said is right. There is no one-size-fits-all, and so drafting legislation in this area can be quite challenging. Our company has supported the notion of comprehensive federal privacy legislation for the past 5 years, and we've been very vocal about that. but we've also been vocal in saying that the legislation can't get too far into the weeds of one particular business model or one particular technology, and that regulation and self-regulation need to work hand in hand. And the area of online behavioral advertising is one area, I think, where that plays out, because what that business model looks like today is probably very different than what it will look like in 2 years, and it's rapidly evolving. And so some of the legislative proposals we've seen, it's too specific. It's more specific than we'd be comfortable with. And we look around the world and look at the different privacy models. You mentioned Canada, which actually has, I think, among the better privacy laws out there, and one that we've certainly been working under for a number of years now. And in terms of what we would look for in the United States is something like that model, I think would be appropriate, supplemented by industry-specific, technology-specific self-regulatory efforts.
Cool, great. Shifting focus for a sec, just so we're not talking about DC all day long. We're at Adweek. I've been struck that because you guys are so consumer-facing, often the discussion in the press around privacy is the internet companies versus the consumer versus, and advertisers, they don't come up a lot in at least some of the discussion. And I wondered if you guys could talk a little bit about what role marketers play in helping you do your jobs, but also, what grade you give the ad community, or, in terms of their handling and the sophistication around understanding these issues. I mean, are they good allies? Are they making your jobs harder sometimes by stuff they're doing?
I think, it's interesting because for a very long time, the privacy discussion was focused on the ad networks that sort of the invisible layer that deliver the advertising and that provide behavioral advertising services. But it's driven largely by advertiser demand, because marketers and advertisers want to reach the right customer at the right time with the right message. I mean, it's very much, what people do in the offline world, right? You customize when you do direct marketing, you don't just send mailers out to every human being on the planet. You try to think about who is my target audience, how do I reach them? It's no different on the internet. So advertisers play a critical role, and we're really seeing participation from that community. And not to, we talk about the ecosystem all the time, but really it is an ecosystem.
What kind of participation are you seeing lately?
Well,
what's different?
In the so the IAB has been working with the 4As, the ANA, the DMA. You have 4,000 companies, major brands, and enormous advertisers who are sitting around the table and talking about how do we, 4,000 of us, participate in a self-regulatory framework. How do we, and that's the kind of participation you have to be able to go back to the FTC and to Congress and say, look, this is for real. You have everybody at the table here, everybody leaning in, pitching in, all, sort of locking arms on this. So I think advertisers have done a much better job being engaged on these issues and demanding, because none of them want to advertise with a partner that's not seen as being responsible on privacy either. Right.
I'll take that one step further, and for everyone out there who is, there's a lot of companies, a lot of advertising companies that are really looking to offer a new way of doing business and a new way of improving the relevance of ads. If you're out there and you're looking at these models, I just, never more than ever before, the public eye will be watching you, and so our industry has, to the extent that we want to preserve a self-regulatory environment, at least even if it's a major component of legislation, as opposed to some actual substantive limits about how you can and cannot use data that might be actually stifling for the growth of our industry, we have to take that responsibility. And it's not just the guys up here, it's all of the smaller actors too have to understand that they have a responsibility as they push forward their models, because someone was going to latch on. It was flash cookies. People focused on flash cookies in the last year. But it'll be something else the next time, and somebody will push a limit and will do something inappropriate, and the next thing you know, we will be facing a kind of regulation that we did not want and didn't invite.
Are you, sorry, that you go in a sec, Tim. But
Yeah, if you don't mind, very briefly, I just want to say I would give the community an A, in part because our ad model is entirely different. It's based on engagement. It's based on the fact that we think that people's social networks and the people who are around them are the most important influencers in their life. And so what we see is a variety of brands and companies beginning to experiment with this new type of social ad, an engagement ad. And so I'm just pleased that people are experimenting with it. And I think they're seeing fabulous results. And so that entry into a new type of advertising market has been very encouraging to me.
Well, mentioned flash cookies. Do any other sort of things come to mind that you're hearing about or just reading about or that are getting attention that are sort of like, eh?
Well, I mean, not specifically. There's certainly been some companies that have gotten. There was recently just a settlement. The FTC engaged a settlement with a company for its advertising practices. There's an
Which one was that?
I'm forgetting the name of it. They just had a settlement announced this week.
Mm-hmm.
Forgetting the name of the company. I think U.S. Search, I believe, was the name of the company. So in terms of that wasn't purely advertising play, but it was, obviously pushing the limits of what the practices were, what acceptable practices were, and we've seen that other places too. But no one's, the key point is that the motivation between something like a flash cookie, and if you're not familiar, that's using Flash as opposed to a regular text cookie that would be stored in your browser, using Flash, the storage in Flash to do that same kind of recognizing and personalization function. But users don't understand how to use those controls, and they're not built into browsers in the same way yet. So it basically avoided people's their control they tried to exercise at deleting their cookies. That kind of effort was actually undertaken, from what I understand, mostly because engineers thought it would be cool. They were like, oh, this solves a problem that I've been dealing with as an engineer. This cookie will stay around when other cookies get deleted. Probably no one thought about the implications of the fact that you were undermining user control.
And to be fair, it's not a it's not a common practice. It's kind of a rogue practice that most people in the industry disavow, precisely because it undermines a user's stated preference. And that's and that's an action. That's where the FTC and others come in, and you see enforcement actions against those types of practices. So I always like to stress that it's written about in a way that's extremely disproportionate to how it's ever been used in the marketplace. And we have lots of good self-regulatory code that says you should not do that. So we do not do that. But it is an area where new technologies and individuals come along with a nifty idea, and we're going to see more of that for sure. But we were very responsive to that particular issue.
Another topic that comes up often is, sure, we have a ton of data, but it's anonymous. And I mean, much of it is. But as we see more of the data I share on Facebook, it by definition isn't anonymous. As Google moving into social networking, trying to add more services, Buzz. Maybe Will and Tim to start, how do you balance sort of it's all anonymous with the idea that you want people to have an account and deliver a service? Maybe let's start there.
I'll take one piece of that, which is to say that we all have to drop the idea that just because something is anonymous, it means it doesn't need to be protected. So I think we want to distinguish between real personally identifiable information and of the traditional kind, and these sort of unique identifiers that have been widely used in the industry, at least in the online ad industry. But that doesn't mean that there should be no protection for these. These often are very sensitive information. We've learned, in many cases, the hard way about the sensitivity of supposedly anonymous information. So that's a first step, is to recognize that need to be protected. You need to have great security in place. You need to make sure that you have honored transparency and control to the extent that you can. And then also you need to recognize that they are different, that these two kinds of information are different. And if Tim wants to speak to any other part of that, feel free.
So I'd make 2 points. One, people who use Facebook are there because they want to be interacting with real people. And it actually confounded the notions that were prevalent even 6 or 7 years ago about how you should interact online. Turns out there's enormous security benefits to being there under your own name with your own alias and all the information about you. If your account gets compromised in some way, you can get corrected. If your friends probably will tell you before you even know that your account has somehow been compromised, and that means that there's quicker reaction time. And I think that actually builds consumer trust. The second point is this, at least on Facebook, we have a different relationship with all the ad companies out here and the brands that are using Facebook than is really prevalent anywhere else on the web. We have an arm's length approach in the sense, when you're on Facebook, you really are only interacting as a Facebook user with Facebook. We serve the ads to our users. We don't share any personally identifiable information, any of this real information, with the actual brand. So a company will come to us and say, we want to serve 100,000 impressions of this type of ad to these people with these 3 or 4 demographic characteristics. And we at Facebook say, we can do that for you. But what we never do is say, we served it to Tim Sparapani, who lives in Washington, D.C. at this address. Here's his IP address. None of that ever happens. So there's not the handoff of the personal information. And I think that that really does promote consumer trust and confidence that people on Facebook are really dealing with just Facebook. And I hope other companies will begin to follow our lead on this.
I think what's interesting in looking back over the last year, and you know, to use the changes at Google and Facebook as an example, you know, it's very hard. We talked earlier about consumer expectations. I think it's very challenging to manage privacy issues in a rapidly changing environment that technology provides, right? So as your products and services are changing, which they will, because innovation is by definition doing something that no one ever thought of before. I think the challenge in privacy is bringing consumers along for the ride. When you have, Yahoo has 600 million consumers, Facebook has 500 million, Google has I don't know how many. I mean, it's a lot of people to be sort of bringing along on that journey, and we're not going to stand still. And I think the question in general about trust is how do you manage trust? And it's about being open and transparent with consumers about what's happening. I just think that that's going to be part and parcel of technology, period, as we go. And so, you know, this is for all of us, I think, the ongoing challenge in dealing with as many consumers as we deal with.
I think what's maybe even more important than bringing consumers along is bringing your own employees along.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Will mentioned the example of, you know, an engineer seeing something that he thought might be kind of cool. Well, you know, that kind of stuff happens, and that's the importance of fostering an awareness of privacy concerns within your own company, mm-hmm. so that when the engineer is coming up with the next great idea, they're thinking, oh, well, you know, what's the impact on privacy? And as technology evolves and as your services evolve, people are building those concerns into it as they're designing those services. Because if you don't have that awareness, you will get these privacy surprises, as Anne mentioned.
Tim, following up on something you said too, so Facebook is increasingly not just how to describe this, but you're sort of serving as you know, the phone book or whatever it is, in the sense that you're a directory and you're also letting increasingly third parties get access to actually who I am, because I mean, with my permission. But if I want to play a game, being myself with my friends, I mean, that is brokering something beyond, you know, Jessica lives in New York, with my permission, obviously. But I mean, how does that? I mean, that seems to complicate, add a new wrinkle to this in a sense. And so just following up a little bit on the arm's lengths with advertisers on the site, how do you, I mean, how do you manage the fact that you are really sharing my identity with the whole web, and that's part of what Facebook's promise and potential and excitement is?
So I think there's 2 answers to that. One, it really is, as you said, about the user's own ownership and control. It is only at the moment when the user authorizes us to make a handoff of their information that we do so. So we really are doing it at their behest. And we think that's essential, that the user has a knowing understanding of what's happening and that they're asking for a benefit to be given to them from that. And I think the other point is this, is that we're not just a platform, I mean, we're not just a company, we're a platform. So we have a whole different ecosystem that is now built on us, applications. There's over 700,000 applications which have actually been built for the Facebook platform. There's all sorts of entities which are potentially gathering data, again, at the user's behest. But that means that we need to set rules and ground rules for how those applications or third-party websites are using this data. So we have a whole series of developer guidelines, application guidelines, where we say you must respect the user's privacy wishes. You should not do things that are inappropriate. There should be no privacy surprises, as Anne suggested earlier. And when there are, we take action. Our consumers tell us about it right away, and we reserve the right and do, in fact, take action against websites or third-party applications who defy those consumer expectations, because, again, it should be all about the user having ownership and control of their data.
I mean, I think that area, I mean, it's something more for you guys to police, right? And sometimes the policing won't be as effective as other times, and I think it's a very interesting area to look at going forward.
So I agree, and I think that this is a good place. So if you ask where regulation might need to go, we might need a stepped up set of enforcement people at the FTC or at state attorneys general office to do the sort of policing, not of necessarily the 4 companies here, because again, anything we do is going to be international news that very same day if we do something that violates consumer trust. It's the smaller companies, it's the derivative actions, the things that weren't anticipated. That's a good place, I think, for there to be increased potential enforcement actions, or at least resources brought to bear. Way downstream to help protect consumers when we can't play that role, and so that consumers feel confident wherever they go.
I think we'll open it up to some questions if anyone's dying. We haven't touched too much about the ad industry, so if you guys are have anything focused on that. Pink shirt up there?
Hey, I wonder if you could talk about the dark side at all. I mean, like for instance, I'm a huge fan of Google, but I mean, weren't they in their Google mapping, taking pictures, and then it was discovered that they were getting like internet passwords as they were driving by. I mean, I'm wondering, like I'm a big fan of Google, but where do we, and all your companies, but isn't there a fine line between what you're doing and a Big Brother scenario, or being co-opted to I wonder if you could talk about what the dark side might be, and why were you trolling for internet passwords?
Well, if you talk to me afterward, I'd probably give you back your password specifically. I'll look it up. You know, I think actually, as Tim said, everything that these companies do up here gets enormous amount of attention. And you know, I think specifically you're talking about our Wi-Fi data. So for anyone who's not familiar with it, when we collected Street View data, so if you use maps, you might have used Street View. It shows pictures along the street. As you go down, if you like look at Times Square, you can see Times Square in 360 degrees as opposed to just looking down from above. So that's a pretty valuable service. We've been collecting that data for 3 years. We also collect location information by using the location of Wi-Fi addresses that we come across. So if you are broadcasting a Wi-Fi account, we will say, okay, we see the latitude and longitude of that Wi-Fi account at a specific location, so that when a user on their mobile phone logs in and we say, oh, they have this Wi-Fi account registered on their phone, we can give them a good sense of their location. Now, of course, location services are their own front, but of course, this is an entirely opt-in service by the user when they're checking their, they want to check their location on their map. In the course of that, there was also a piece of code that was collecting data from unencrypted Wi-Fi accounts as it drove down the street. Now, that data was never used in any product or service, and it was not actually ever intended to be used. It was, again, one of these situations of an engineer who thought something would be cool. As soon as we discovered that that was going on, we've stopped it. We don't collect that information anymore. We're trying to get rid of it as soon as we're legally allowed to do so. So that's that incident. But I want to get to your question, which is about, what's the dark side out there? And I think the dark side is that people lose faith in us and what we can do. I think you raised that point. You love our services. I'm glad you do. But there's going to be a lot of people out there that are going to hear a story like this that is just going to vastly undermine their faith in coming to Google or coming to any other company if they have a similar incident and using it, because they're going to say, well, what are they really doing? That's a lot of data. What are they actually doing with it? And that's our struggle, right? So that's, we're going to pursue that on a lot of fronts. One is we're going to hopefully never do bonehead things like that again, but in addition, we're going to look for how can we internally improve our process? How can we look for the right mix of law and self-regulation in order to have a good balance there, so we're still innovating and yet have established that trust in the whole industry. And we're going to be taking those steps to try to make sure we don't have these sort of, the dark side. Now, there'll always be conspiracy-minded people out there, and you can't help that, and we're a big company, we understand that. But hopefully, for our vast majority of users, we can keep that relationship on the right footing, and that's our challenge.
I think it's also, I think it was Louis Brandeis who said that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And so transparency matters. I think if you, one of the ways to allay concerns and fears about, well, how much do you collect, what are you doing with it, we've created tools to give consumers a perspective on this is what we think you're interested in and here's why. I know Microsoft, Google, and Yahoo each have a tool like that where you can go in, you can kick the tires, you can opt out of categories, you can opt out of all. But I found that that's been a very effective tool just to say, we're opening the kimono, here's what it is. It's not really that scary. If you stop and think about, the world of data, Online data is but a piece of it, and there has been a whole data economy where there's a lot of personally identifiable information being bought and sold every day. People in this community know it better than most, but I don't think consumers are very well aware of how much information, by and large, is used, and used for the benefit of consumers. So I think when you look at what we have, I actually would go so far as to say, I think in many respects you have more privacy online, more information, more access, more control than you do in the offline world, in fact.
That's right. I mean, does anyone out here have a supermarket loyalty card? That's giving you great discounts at the store, but that data is being used to market to you. And it's being sold to marketing firms that use it, and you might be part of that industry, you might be doing that. It's been going on for a long time. And it's personally identifiable data in many cases, and it certainly is to the supermarket.
We've got to wrap up. Sorry, I'm getting put, but it is, I mean, thank you guys. And I do think that it's the parallels to the offline world are really important to think about. But there is also just so much online too, right, at the end of the day, and I think that's why we can guarantee that this is going to be a fascinating topic going forward. But thank you guys. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to all of you for being here today, too. So we have one final piece for you, and I just want to say that I am just so honored to be able to welcome her to the stage to give her perspective on trust at this time. Her name is Nancy Kane, and she is a professor at the Harvard Business School and historian who follows leadership and frames the issue of trust well. And Nancy? And Nancy also is an avid horse rider in a very serious way and had a bit of an accident, so she is here. We thank her immensely for coming here despite her challenge today.
Well, thank you very much, Lorene. It's a pleasure to be here. I actually, my teenage show jumper bucked me off at a horse show about 4 weeks ago. So he and I are reforging our bond of trust that is so critical to riding and competing successfully. I'm a historian by training, as Lorene said, and I want to just spend just a very few minutes locating this moment and trust in the larger frame. So we are living at really one of the biggest inflection points certainly in the last 200 years of industrial capitalism, the largest in this country's history in at least 70 years, when socially, economically, politically, psychically, technologically, the game is up for grabs. So when people talk about the new normal, we are really talking about a moment when all things, all older traditions and paradigms and structures are up for grabs. We're not reading about it that way, but that is what is happening at a very deep level. And one of the most important aspects of that, and so the question at a very high level for leaders, whether you're a school principal, a mother and a father trying to educate your kids well, the CEO of a public corporation, a government official, a banker, an investment banker today, whoever you are a leader with a big or a small or a medium-sized L. And the question is really, what are we going to do with all the possibility and all the challenge that sits at this moment when so much is being rebooted, even if we're not reading about it in the papers or reading about it on the internet every day, and even if we can't see it directly. It's happening. It's happening in consumer behavior. It's happening in household and economic decisions. It's happening quietly, but very steadily beneath the, if you will, the tectonic plates of the global financial system. It is happening. And so the question around trust at a moment of great possibility and great challenge is, are we going to stay where we were last year? Last year when we met, trust was on everyone's lips, and yet we were all in a kind of state of shock and awe, kind of groping in the dark, and lots of big financial institutions were taking out one-page ads in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and it was shots in the dark and triaging around what had unquestionably been an astounding abdication of public trust in a series of organizations and established institutions. That was last year. This year, a year later, I see from a historical perspective that we are at a very different juncture. And the question, in keeping with what I said at the beginning about all this white space of this massive inflection point, is, are we going to take a serious, hard look at honoring the importance of collective trust? We talk about it. You know, I'm for peace and I'm for justice and I think world poverty should be eradicated. But unless we transcend talking about it and really start looking at a micro level at the different aspects of trust and how it is collected and lost and important and part of who we are as organizations and groups and families and individuals, we are frittering away an amazingly important opportunity. So let's take a yoga breath for a second on that and say, what does it mean to take a hard look at the importance of collective trust and to say, I'm going to or I'm not going to honor that importance? What we see right now, if you kind of just do a big, again, kind of historian's magpie-like look at the tapas bar of data, is we're not much better off than we were a year ago. So collective trust in Congress is about 17%. Collective trust in insurance companies is 21%. Collective trust in pharmaceuticals is 20%. Collective trust in the federal government is a little bit higher than that, but not much. And collective trust in financial institutions is right there, hovering around 20%. And for big business more generally, just a little bit higher. Those are really astoundingly low numbers. Right? And, you know, they are amazingly low numbers. They're as low on an aggregate basis as they've been in about 4 decades. And if we look at how people are responding to that, in customers, shareholders, employees, households, communities, what we see is people pulling back from their faith in organized institutions and trying to take back all kinds of nights for themselves. The financial night, household saving, is way up. The education night, homeschooling, is way up. The alternative or complementary medical night, spending and activity in all kinds of aspects around healthcare. We got scared last year. We're still scared. We don't trust the system, and we don't trust who will provide us the means to pay for that system. All of our responses to that are about how can I have more control over my healthcare because I don't trust the people that were once experts. So in lots of different ways. We don't trust advertisers. We trust people on the internet that are other customers like us, or mothers, or fathers, or employees, unemployed. We don't, dieters, we don't trust established experts. So there's no evidence, quantitatively or qualitatively, that collective trust is coming back. And yet, I just wrote a book review about a new book on Adam Smith, who writes a lot about the organizing power of self-interest and the individual transactions leading to a socially beneficial end. I read this and I thought to myself, that may have been a very, very powerful organizing concept for the first 200 years of industrial capitalism. But right now, in a global economy where we are so tightly bound together in all kinds of ways, what if collective trust is actually more important than caveat emptor to the successful functioning of our global village? So I think we've arrived at this very, very interesting point where the decisions that now have to be made by all kinds of leaders are decisions about whether you really think that having, as opposed to just saying, and earning back the or maintaining the trust of your distinct stakeholders matters to the mission of yourself and the organization or group or family that you're charged with responsibility. I made a movie a couple of years ago about Abraham Lincoln and what individual leaders had learned about him. So I interviewed all these CEOs. And A.G. Lafley, who was then the CEO of Procter & Gamble, said this. He said, look, leaders are not born. They are made. And there are 3 elements to that. On the one hand, you have an individual that comes, to a point with a set of gifts and weaknesses and experiences, and they find themselves at a second moment, a second element, a moment that demands leadership, that demands, I would say in this instance, worthy, credible stewards of our trust. But a third thing has to come into play, and that is that the individual leader has to decide to get in the game and embrace the cause. So the question really for all kinds of us is, do we want to think hard and deeply with the left and the right side of our brains about the importance of trust in our lives, in our households, in our organizations, in our polity? And if we do, then we're going to have to make a whole bunch of decisions, mostly micro decisions, about how we regain or re-earn or maintain or as important, and this is a little bit unusual because it takes us out of the realm of intimate relationships, although what we're really talking about is a kind of collective intimacy and cohesion. We have to really look at how we communicate, other than words, reasons for people to trust us and us to trust them. So if you ask me for a couple of examples of people I think that are doing this well right now, institutions, I'd point to Oprah Winfrey, who's a very, very savvy businesswoman with an amazingly high, profitable business with 400 people and a run rate of over $1 billion a year, who understands very, very well that the essence of her competitive advantage is the trust that her viewers have in her and the trust that she places in her viewers. So she has been incredibly disciplined about the stewardship of that trust. I think about another company or another set of individuals, I think about Hyundai and the decision on the part of that corporation and its marketing experts to launch this very interesting, very powerful campaign that has just blown everybody else out of the water. I'll give you one other data point that's worth just a tiny bit of thought. You won't have ever heard of this company, but it's an auto company, another auto company called Local Motors, founded by a young man about 1.5 years ago in the midst of this terrible, at the time seemed unstoppable recession. And it's all about the trust of the auto company in having their customers design the cars themselves. It's very, very interesting. So that's really the issue. Do you want to get in the game? And if so, are you willing, in the face of strong, multifaceted forces that are pushing us towards cynicism and pushing us toward fast decision making and pushing us away from taking people on the hard, difficult, enormously important and rewarding and satisfying road to maintaining trust and honoring it, do you want to get in that game? Let me close just by mentioning both these pictures. This is Abraham Lincoln. Won't say too much about him except to say that the trust that Lincoln held on to in an astoundingly turbulent and bloody war of enough Americans credibly held on to, particularly the soldiers in 1864 who really elected him. It was men in the field that elected him in that critical second term that really defined the post-war world and defined that slavery would actually end. Lincoln's leadership and the stakes there, which were very, very high, depended ultimately and almost completely on the trust he had in the American people and the trust they offered him. And the other person on this slide is a guy named Ernest Shackleton. So he's a lot less well known. This is an extraordinary story of an explorer, an Irish explorer who went to the South Pole and basically got stuck on the ice in 1914 and 15. No GPS, no cell phones. 28 men, almost 2 years. And that story is about, it's about a leader who recognized that without the trust of his men, Lord of the Flies would set in very, very quickly. That's what's threatening to happen to our polity right now, and that the mission would fail. And it was through maintaining and honoring that trust that he brought all those people home to safety, and just against extraordinary odds. So big and small, when the stakes are high, honoring trust and its critical role in how we lead organizations and find the better angels of our nature is all. Thank you.
So I just want to say a big thank you to all of you for taking the time to be here, and hopefully some of you share the same passion we do about the important agenda of trust and the need to address the low trust environment. But as Nancy and many of the others that you've heard from here today said, there is tremendous opportunity in this time if people want to take a moment, as some of the companies that we talked about earlier who have dropped 1 or 2 stones of their own to create positive ripples. We have given all of you a stone of your own for you to drop, for you to also create your own positive ripple. Thank you.